Voting in the presidential election is about to pick up speed. Early voting starts Monday in Georgia, and election officials are preparing for swarms of voters. Early voting lasts for 3 weeks leading up to the big day on November 3rd, 2020. By the time early voting ends, it's very likely that most votes will have already been cast. In all, about 5 million Georgians are expected to cast ballots this election. I'm Mark Nisi, the Elections Administration and Voting Rights reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm joined today by AJC political reporter Patricia Murphy. This is the second in our weekly series of Facebook chats leading up to the November 3rd election. This week, we'll focus on what to expect during early voting, which has become incredibly popular in Georgia in recent years, and answer frequently asked questions about how it works and what difference it will make so that everyone's vote does count this election. To start with, the big day is Monday, October 12th. Many early voting locations are going to open at 7 a.m. on Monday. Others will open a little bit later. Some aren't available all 3 weeks, but every county in Georgia has to have at least one early voting location. And of course, in counties with large populations, you have a lot more early voting locations. Let's flip to a video from the Secretary of State's office talking about early voting and the opportunity for voters to get their ballots cast.
Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger is securing the vote.
Securing the vote is my number one priority.
That's why Georgia is upgrading to an auditable paper ballot system. Protecting ballot integrity and making sure every ballot is counted. And providing each county necessary supplies to clean and disinfect voting equipment. Visit securevotega.com to learn more. Paid for by Help America Vote Act.
Early voting was embraced by Georgians in recent years. It usually makes up about half of all votes cast in elections. This year will be different because so many of those voters, instead of voting in person early voting, will be voting remotely using absentee ballots. But early voting will still be significant. As you saw, election officials like Secretary of State Raffensperger are really pushing people to vote early because the more people who vote before Election Day, the shorter lines will be on Election Day. And also, if you vote early, your vote counts just like an Election Day vote, and you lock it in, and your choice for those candidates that you want to get into office will be reflected on election night during early voting. Let's hear from Patricia about some of the races that we'll be choosing and some that may or may not be decided based on votes that get in before November 3rd.
Well, thank you, Mark, for having me. I want to first say that you are a national treasure. Mark Nisi is the expert of all experts in how to vote in Georgia, and because there are a lot of questions about how to vote, he is the man that we are so lucky to have in the state, and I feel really lucky to be on staff with you now. So I wanted to just get that out of the way. That's my disclaimer, that I'm thrilled to be here with you because I rely on your reporting, not just for my own reporting, but also for my voting. So I really appreciate it.
You're very generous.
Yes.
I'd be remiss to not let our readers know that Patricia does fantastic work, and she has some great articles both today and tomorrow that you'll want to read.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, well, now we've got the paid programming out of the way. So elections in Georgia, we were talking about this earlier, in the past have sometimes trended on the predictable side, especially at the presidential level. As a state that has gone heavily Republican in the past, and before that heavily Democratic, we often would have early nights here in Georgia, but we know that this is going to be a late night here in Georgia for a number of races, and we may not know the answers to how these races are going to turn out until later in the day, later in the night, maybe even later in the week. So voters need to be very patient. Pack your patience on election night. You may not know what happened until you wake up the next morning or the next morning, and that's okay. But so we wanted to talk about some of the elections that we know are going to be close. First of all, of course, the presidential race. Every poll that we have seen over the last many weeks has shown Georgia essentially tied between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And so poll after poll after poll is telling us this. The trend is not changing. So we're expecting a close race. And with millions of votes to count, that's going to take a while. And so we could be in for a long night or a long couple of days with the presidential race. Also, next to the top of the ticket, those two Georgia Senate races, also incredibly close. The race between David Perdue and Jon Ossoff, essentially just too close to call right now based on all of the polling that we're seeing, and a lot of the as well in terms of where are people energized, where's the money coming from, what are the questions anecdotally that we're getting. So we know that Purdue Ossoff race very close, and that may not be decided early, may not be decided until the next day. Also the Kelly, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Or it might not be decided until January.
Well,
right?
I'm so sorry. What am I saying?
Because
course.
there's also a third candidate, right?
That's exactly right. There's a Libertarian candidate in that first Senate race, so we could be looking at a runoff between David Perdue and Jon Ossoff. The second Senate race, we will almost certainly see a runoff if the polls hold up as they should. That is a very, very crowded Senate race. That is Senator Kelly Loeffler, the current senator, the incumbent. She has a field of just about 20 challengers, so you divide that up. We are certainly likely to see a runoff there because you have to have 50% to get an outright win here in Georgia. But also for Senator Loeffler and her closest challengers, they're all just very tightly packed in there. And so we may not know who is going to the runoff until later in the evening. So between her, Reverend Raphael Warnock, and a number of other candidates, Doug Collins, a Republican congressman right now. So we may not know who's going to the runoff until later in the evening or perhaps the next day as well. Races get a lot easier to call when there's more of a partisan advantage, so we'll expect to see the results in open seats. The 5th district should come in pretty early, where Nikema Williams is running against Angela Stanton King. The 9th district is the open seat for Doug Collins' seat. That's Andrew Clyde against Devin Pandy. We expect that to come in pretty early. Then also the 14th district, which is where Marjorie Taylor Greene is running essentially unopposed because the Democrat who was running against her has dropped out. So we'll have a number of close races huddled at the top of the ticket. Also the 6th and 7th districts we expect to be quite close, and we'll have to see when those come in. We expect those could be some late nights as well.
And I think it's important to note that in those close races, whether it be President, Senate, or U.S. House, we might not even know the next day. It could take a few days to really count all the ballots, including absentee ballots. We're continuing to see so many absentee ballots come in, and while many of those will be tabulated on election night, there are sure to be some that will have to be counted after Election Day as required by Georgia law. Absentee ballots have to be counted. All votes have to be counted if they are received by 7 p.m. on November 3rd, and county election officials have 10 days before they certify election results. So it could be a few days before we know the ultimate outcomes of some of these races. I also want to talk about the act of early voting. I went out to the DeKalb Elections Office on Memorial Drive yesterday just to interview and talk with some voters, get a feel of how they're doing as they were dropping off their absentee ballots. And at least at that location, there's just incredible excitement. Everybody I talked to wanted to give me their names, wanted to let them know how they felt about the race, which is rare for being a reporter. You know, a lot of times people don't want to give their names, but everybody wanted to make sure that their voice was heard and their vote does count. And I expect that enthusiasm to continue during early voting, which starts Monday morning. Now, what we usually see, and we have a chart that kind of shows this from past years, from the 2016 general election, the 2018 general election, and the 2020 primary. You usually see early voting start out slow during that first week, and then it picks up a bit in the second and third weeks. And often this doesn't quite show up in the chart, but that first thing on Monday morning on October 12th is likely to be a busy time. There are always people who want to be first in line, who want to make sure their vote gets counted and want to be there right when polls open. And of course, we'll be covering that too and watching how voters' experience is going and looking for lines. And frankly, I expect some lines. You know, people are really going to turn out for this election. And then the other time when lines accumulate is those last couple days, that Thursday and Friday before the election. there's always long lines on those days. But that leaves a lot of time. It's 3 weeks of early voting, and you don't have to go on the first day or the last 2 days. I and election officials really encourage people to check out voting on those Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays in those middle periods when oftentimes you can walk in and walk out. Even in this election with 5 million voters, there are going to be plenty of times when there aren't lines. We saw during the primary, the peak time for lines on June 9th was right around 5 p.m. There were also bumps when polls opened and a couple other times, but dinner time when people are getting off work and in the morning when people are on their way into work, that's the busiest time. So you might want to consider planning not to go at those times because, again, it's easier to vote if you don't have to wait in line, and your vote will count just as much if you get it in on November 3rd or on October 15th or whatever day it may be.
My sister actually asked me, when should I go, because I don't want to wait in line. So now I can tell her.
Yes, don't go on the first day, don't go on the last day. I think you mentioned I don't see any audience questions just yet, but I do want to get to them when we can. You were mentioning some questions that you had at the beginning.
I did. Well, actually, I want to go through a basic question, and this is based on questions that I get from my friends. I think anybody who works at a newspaper or in digital reporting has their friends just asking me questions around election time. And one question I get a lot is, what is the difference between early voting and absentee voting? My friends who have been here a long time are not understanding the difference. And if you could just, it's very basic, but I think an important distinction when we're talking about this, when we're using those terms.
Sure. So early voting is the 3 weeks of in-person voting that you can do before Election Day. Georgia has had this for a long time now, and it's before every election. You have to have 3 weeks of early voting from the Monday starting October 12th up until the Friday before Election Day, and that time is available. It has to be in every county. Georgia also has a mandatory Saturday of in-person early voting in every county on October 24th. And a lot of people who work during the week, that's a great time to go on that Saturday. Absentee voting is where you request an absentee ballot. Your election officials will send it to you in the mail, and you can either mail it back or put it in a drop box. Both are considered advance voting. One is in person, one is by mail. And as I said, in past elections, like in 2016, it was, let me look at this. Yeah, in 2018, 48% were in-person early voters, 46% on election day, and 6% did absentee.
That's amazing.
That really changed in this year's primary when 49% voted absentee, only 14% early voting, and 37% on election day. This year, most election officials are saying it'll probably be pretty close to about even thirds. You'll get about 1/3 election day, 1/3 early voting, 1/3 absentee. That's a rough estimate, but I think that's about the range we're talking about.
Okay, and now for people watching, when does your ballot need to be in order to be counted? I think that's been sort of a moving target in the courts lately, but I know you've been following it.
Yes, that's a great question. A federal appeals court ruled a little over a week ago that absentee ballots must be received by 7 p.m. on Election Day, November 3rd. There had been some dispute. A lower court judge had extended that deadline, but that lower court ruling is no longer in effect. Georgia state law and the federal appeals court both say ballots have to be received by county election offices by 7 p.m. on November 3rd. So don't put it in the mail November 3rd. Postmark doesn't matter. What matters is when the county election office receives it. So if you still have your absentee ballot a week out from Election Day, you might really want to consider putting it in a drop box rather than putting it in the mail because, mail can take 4 or 5 days to arrive sometimes, usually more like 3, but if you want to be safe, you want to make sure that your ballot is received by the county elections office by 7 p.m. on November 3rd.
Okay. Here's another question that I get. When voters go in for in-person voting, they're going to see new machines, aren't they?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
And what are they going to see?
That's excellent. Georgia has a new statewide voting system. It was tested for the first time in local elections last November and rolled out statewide in the primary. And that will be used both on election day and during these 3 weeks of early voting. And this replaces the last voting machine system that we had for the last 18 years, which was all electronic. There was no paper ballot. This new voting system is kind of a hybrid. You still use touchscreens to make your choices, just like on the old voting system, but it's attached to a printer that prints out a paper ballot. And it has a QR code on it that encodes your candidate choices. It also has a text printout of your choices. And you're encouraged to review your choices, make sure they're right. If they're not right or you change your mind, you can ask a poll worker to start over, and they will cancel or spoil your ballot. But if it is right, after you review it, then you can insert it into the optical scanning machine and it will display a message saying your vote has been received.
Okay, because I know some of the complaints before, when it was just touch screens, people would say, well, how do I even know what was recorded? I wouldn't even know who I voted for. People who were worried about those kinds of things. So I think that answers a lot of people's anxieties. But how have the machines, how did they work during the primary? There were lots of lines. Was that due to the machines or due to human error, or what was going on?
Yes.
With that, I know you followed that.
Yes, there were a lot of reasons, and the machines were part of it. Turnout was part of it. Troubles with absentee voting was part of it, because with so many people voting absentee, election officials got backlogged. Fewer precincts, a lot of precincts had to close because they weren't having anybody inside, especially like churches, for example. Or also poll workers quit. The average age for poll workers in Georgia before coronavirus was 72 years old.
Oh my gosh.
And I can understand those people saying, I don't want to interact with strangers at the polls. So the June primary was incredibly stressed for election officials because new voting machines that they didn't have a lot of experience using. And then you had newly hired poll workers to replace the ones who had quit, who sometimes all they had was virtual training. Hands-on training wasn't happening at the time. And that just created for a very difficult environment where the machines, the coronavirus, the turnout, the lack of precincts, the lack of training for poll workers, and just everything added up to being a big problem. This November, election officials say they've learned their lessons, that they are making improvements, that they do know how to work. They've resumed hands-on training, and they think that they won't have as many problems this time around. There was one recent wrinkle that came up in a couple weeks ago where there was a problem with the programming of the voting machines. And we were talking about that U.S. Senate race that has 20 candidates.
The Loeffler race, right.
Correct. And because there are so many candidates, they had to display it on the touchscreens in 2 separate columns, which is not the usual way of doing it. They could have had it just one long column and had voters scroll down to the bottom, but then election officials looked at it and said, well, is that really fair to candidates who have names in the lower half of the alphabet who voters might not see? And you might think, well, voters are going to vote for who they want to, but ballot style really does make a difference. You see every election candidates who are listed with the I for incumbent next to their name, or who are listed higher alphabetically in the ballot, do get more votes. So the problem was, it was divided into 2 columns. The second column, if you did a particular set of touches on the screen, the second column would sometimes disappear, which is obviously a huge problem for those candidates with last names L to Z.
Yes, Joe Zimby would be very upset.
Yes. So state election officials, along with the state's voting company, are replacing the software on all 34,000 touch screens in Georgia to supposedly fix this issue. There's some conflict over how big of a problem this is. State election officials say it's a very minor change that won't cause any problems. But then you have election security advocates who say, look, you're changing the code of computers just a few weeks before the election starts. Who knows what other problems you're introducing? Who knows, can we trust these people installing this software on the computers? That issue is in federal court right now, but the software is being installed. I think we can all hope that the software really is a minor change and doesn't introduce any new problems. And certainly, you don't want candidates disappearing from the ballot.
No.
But also, you need to find a way to ensure that an election is safe and secure. So that's a difficult issue. I certainly think that they're working through it.
Yeah,
you
well,
know?
you'll be on it. We know you'll be watching, and they
Right.
know you'll be watching, so that's a good thing. And you mentioned the federal courts. I feel like the federal courts are sort of the third player in this game. They are weighing in all the time on all sorts of questions between the Democrats and the Republicans. And what was the recent ruling about people who had voted absentee but then weren't sure that their ballots were going to be received, and so they went ahead and voted in person, or there was some concern that people were going to do that. And then was there a decision that there needed to be a printout of who is registered and had requested a ballot, or what were the details on that?
Yes. So a judge ruled that there need to be updated paper backups of voter registration information to check if someone's registration doesn't show up when they try to vote, so that they can use this as a backup, and also to have a printout of absentee voting information to check if somebody has requested or voted an absentee ballot. These are paper backup systems that probably won't be used. All this information is on the voting check-in computers, but this is a precaution in case there are problems. The Secretary of State's office is appealing this decision, saying it creates a burden on local election officials to print out so much paper the weekend before the election. But on the other hand, you have the plaintiffs in the lawsuit saying this is a protection. This will help voters. This will save the state if there are emergency situations, if voters do have problems, if there are power outages, if computer software doesn't work, if people aren't able to be checked in, if there are conflicts over whether someone's absentee ballot has been returned or not returned.
Yes, I do feel like sometimes Georgia proves if something can go wrong, it will somewhere at some precinct somewhere. Yeah. So a couple of very basic questions, but if somebody's new to the state, they may not know the answer to this. What do you need to take with you when you go to vote here in Georgia?
Georgia requires photo ID. That's all you need. You
Okay.
do need your photo ID. That can be a driver's license, it can be a state ID card, it can be a passport, it can be a government ID. There's a whole list of acceptable IDs, but photo ID is required to vote in person in Georgia. I believe we've had that law since the early 2000s.
Okay.
2000, I'm not sure exactly, mid 2000s anyway. But otherwise, you just need to bring yourself. And I also wanted to talk about what you'll see at the polls, some of the
Great.
safety precautions that will be in place because of the coronavirus. You don't necessarily have to touch the touchscreens with your finger. Polling places will have styluses where you can use that to touch the screen, and after you're done, those styluses will be sanitized and set aside. There will be plexiglass at the voting check-in stations, separating you from the poll workers who check you in. There will be face shields and masks for the poll workers. And of course, voters are also encouraged to wear masks, although they can't be forced to for the most part. But at least in my experience interviewing voters, I've been impressed at how many voters are respectful of others when they go to vote. And I have seen high levels of mask wearing at the polls, more than you'll see in Walmart, for example.
Just for example.
Yes. Although they've gotten better over the
They
last
have
few
gotten
months.
better.
Yeah.
Yes, they have.
I mean, even in June or July, I was like, yeah, I don't know. But now it
I think
seems...
we're on board.
Right.
Georgia's
right.
on board, just about.
Hand sanitizer will be available. Also, poll workers will be cleaning off the machines with sanitizer. And social distancing will be a big thing. Only a certain number of people will be allowed inside the polling place at a time. And even outside the polling place, there will be line managers in many precincts keeping people 6 feet away. That'll be hard in practice in some cases, but I think people generally don't want to be close to other people anyway. It might make the lines look longer than they really are because
Yes.
they'll be spread out. The key is for the line to keep moving. If the line keeps moving, The goal for election officials is to have people in and out in about 30 minutes.
Okay, and can I hand you off one of these? We have a question from our community conversations. These are our subscribers, mostly, I think. So we have a question from a subscriber. With the use of high publicity voting places such as State Farm Arena, do election workers worry that voters might think you could go to the site regardless of what county you live in? Did they run into any of that kind of confusion during the August runoff? That's a great question.
Absolutely. You can only vote in the county where you live. So State Farm Arena has great capacity, 300 voting machines, 60 voter check-in stations. It'll be, even on the heaviest days, I think voters will be able to get in and out at State Farm.
But is it just for your precinct or your county? Who gets to vote at State Farm?
Anyone in Fulton County can vote in any of their early voting locations.
Oh, great. Okay.
So Fulton County voters can vote at the High Museum. Fulton County voters can vote at State Farm Arena. Fulton County voters, there's more than
some
30.
great options.
Yes, there's more than 30 early voting locations in Fulton County.
Okay.
They've really expanded to try to get as many people as they can voting early before November 3rd. But during early voting, you can vote at any early voting location in your county. We will have a map available, I believe, as soon as tomorrow on our website at ajc.com showing early voting locations. You can go to any of those locations as long as they're in your county. That is different from Election Day. On November 3rd, you must report to the precinct where you are assigned to, which is close to where your residence is located.
Okay, a great question, community. Thank you so much for that. Now, Mark, we don't expect this to happen, but if somebody goes to their polling place and the poll worker says, "You're not registered here, I don't know what to tell you," what do you do in that case?
So there are choices. If they tell you you're registered in a different precinct, you can go to that different precinct.
Okay.
And that's probably, if you can, the best thing to do, because if you're not in the wrong precinct, you might not have all of your local races listed on your ballot, because they don't provide necessarily ballot styles for every race, for every if it's not in that geographic area. Alternatively, though, let's say you're busy. Let's say you just want to vote for whatever races you can. You can ask for a provisional ballot.
Okay.
A provisional ballot is a paper ballot that will be counted after Election Day, after they verify that it is correct, and after they verify which races you are eligible to vote in. But you can fill out a paper provisional ballot if you are in the wrong precinct, and only the races you are eligible to vote on will be counted. So you might miss out on some races if you vote a provisional ballot if you're in the wrong location.
Okay.
But that is one way to make sure you get your vote in if you're in the wrong precinct.
Okay. And I think we're running a little short on time, but Mark, you have so many stories that you're following. What are you going to be watching for specifically between now? I'm going to say Election Day, but there'll be a million things, but what are you most watching most carefully?
I'm watching for what happens. I want to hear from voters and see what they are seeing. We'll really know a lot more next week when early voting starts. We'll be watching, are there lines? Are the expanded number of early voting locations going to fix the problem? Are the technicians and additional training going to prevent computer problems with the voting equipment? How are voters going to like the voting machines? In my experience talking with voters, if they work, people like them. If they don't work, they hate them, and that makes sense.
It does make sense.
Georgians are very familiar with voting on a touchscreen. But also, I think because this is a high turnout election and because there are more steps in the voting process with this voting system, you have to check in first, then wait for a touchscreen, then wait for the optical scanner to insert your ballot. That'll make it take a little bit longer than under Georgia's old voting system. And with so many people voting, that creates an additional possibility of lines.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to hit you with this curveball. How should people let you know if they're having problems, or if they want to tell you what their experience has been, or alert you to problems that they want us to know about?
That's great.
We want to
hear from you. Yes. So the AJC has a Google form where you can just search AJC report voting problems, and you can fill out our form. That will feed it into myself and other reporters, and we might be able to hear your stories and contact you. We need voters' help to be able to report what's happening out there. You can also email me. I love getting email. I'm getting a little bit backlogged. I try to respond to almost every single email I receive, but it's getting hard, but I do see them all. My email address is my first name and last name, so MARK dot, N as in November, IESSE at ajc.com. That's MARK.NIESSE at ajc.com. And, you know, I wish I could write every story and write about every problem voters are having. Often I use this information to feed into larger stories. If a lot of people are having the same problem you are, then I'm much more likely to cover it. I feel like I want to work on behalf of the voters. I want to be their voice and tell their stories about what they're seeing at the polls. And I apologize if I can't get to every story, but I will be working as hard as I can to tell as much news as we can.
Well, we know you will, Mark. You always do. You always have. That's why you're Mark Neesey.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us today at the AJC's Facebook chat on early voting in the 2020 election. Join us every Thursday at 5 p.m. on the AJC's Facebook page for conversations about this year's election. Upcoming chats will focus on Georgia's changing demographics, whether Georgia really is a battleground state, long lines, voting machines, and other preparations. Voting matters, and this is democracy in action, so please participate and vote and read the AJC both on ajc.com and in the print newspaper. Thank you for your subscription, and thank you for watching. And thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.